Bene, buonasera a tutti, benvenuti.
Good evening to you all, and welcome to the meeting entitled Rights, Duties and Common Good. Tonight we have with us two guests whom I warmly thank for being here. To my left, you can see Mr. Luciano Violante, Emeritus President of the Italian Chamber of Deputies. And to my right, Professor Costantino Esposito, full professor of history philosophy at the University of Bari. Tonight's meeting is going to be a dialogue between the two of them. I will lay some topics and some questions on the table, questions and topics concerning rights, duties, and common good, and they will dwell upon that. First question to President Violante. In his recent interview to an Italian newspaper, Osservatore Romano, entitled Starting Once Again from the Community, you said that we cannot think about past recipes focused on unlimited expansion of rights until turning desires into rights. A new meaning of life can only be ensured by a policy based on duties. Duties give a meaning to life, not rights. But no one is talking about duties today. You also wrote a book on this topic. What are the duties that we should rediscover as individual people and as a community as a whole? And maybe don't duties risk to be considered as a moralist statement? Can we show the picture? Okay, this is a picture called The Fall of Icarus. You can see here this guy who is well dressed with a plow in his hand, some shepherds. Each one of them is doing his job. There's a boat, and here you have Icarus who fell down. And nobody has realized that he fell down. Nobody realized that a young guy put on some wings, defied the gravity laws, went too high, the sun melted his wings, he fell down, and nobody realized. I think that, this picture was made in the mid-16th century by Bruegel. Bruegel was clever enough to capture this detail. There's more pictures about Icarus in the 20th century, portraying Icarus with big wings falling down. But here, the picture talks about a human problem, humane rather. People do not realize what is happening. So the first duty we all have is to realize what is happening around us, because only being very careful and looking at our iPad, our smartphones, our job, we don't realize what's happening around us. But this is a duty we have. I read on a website that there's 4,000 people who have gone back to Libya. It means that they escaped from Libya and then they had to go back. We all know what Libyan lagers are. Has there been any reaction to that? Have we realized about that? As Europe realized that it had sent back Libyan refugees, and I told you that because during the Nazi period there was a ship on which many Jews went to flee from Germany. The ship arrived in Brazil. Brazil pushed the ship away because it couldn't become an enemy of Germany. They went to Cuba. Cuba sent them away because it couldn't be an enemy of Germany. They went to the United States. They accepted some minors and pushed away other people because the United States couldn't be an enemy of Germany. So the ship came back. Fortunately, the captain, who was an anti-Nazi German, made sure that these Jews were welcomed by many other countries. This news spread around, not in Italy, not in Germany, but in other countries. And that news was more popular than the 4,000 people who had to go back to Libya, to those camps. And these are things that we have to gaze upon, that we have to look at. There's not just the present, there's human beings around us. So we all have the duty. Then we can all find our own personal duty. I believe that the lack of interest we have in others is underlying the moral crisis that is hitting Western Europe. Pope Ratzinger made some remarks on two conferences made by Father Giussani, and Ratzinger talked about nihilism, saying that at some point we need to find once again the meaning of life, because nihilism says that life is doomed to nothing. Nihilism doesn't have any rules. Everything is left to destiny. Nihilism is different from relativism. Then Costantino will maybe explain to us the difference between the two of them. Nihilism means nullifying everything. And how can we fight against that? Because to me, this is the human issue, how to fight against the destruction of values, which we can see everywhere. And it's easy. Apparently, it's very easy to live without duties because all the problem starts from the lack of duties. And I will continue with your second question. The legal idea of duties is that duties are seen versus rights, rights and duties. But rights and duties have different sources, because the right starts from the person, and we talk about subjective rights. The duties start from the community. Duties are what keep people together. A community is based on mutual duties and not mutual rights. Then we have personal rights, but the community can be kept together thanks to mutual duties. This is fundamental. Without duties, there can be no community. The reason why there is a crisis in the political arena in most Western countries is due to the fact that political groups are no longer communities. They are pyramids or lifts, call them whatever you want. They are not communities of peers. And that jeopardizes public ethics. If political parties are based on a boss, on a person who is in charge, a boss cannot define ethics. A boss can only embody power. The crisis of public ethics and political ethics is due to that. If political parties are just based upon their boss, clearly those political parties will find it hard to discover public ethics. And there's a misunderstanding between public ethics and crime law. The crime code is becoming the Magna Carta of political ethics. Because that is the only system of rules based upon values. It gives a hierarchy of values. As we desperately need values, and this is not negative to me, it means that people are calling for values. Therefore, we have to leverage on this demand for values, call for values. And finally, you mentioned, we've just mentioned an article. What has replaced facts today? Feelings, emotions. I read about an American philosopher who said, what is important, what matters is not facts, but emotions. You need to make people feel their emotions. If you look at newspaper headlines, they are mostly not based on truths, but on emotions, on the fact that they have to unleash emotions. I'm old, and I'm struck by the fact that everybody's taking pictures of everything. Everybody takes pictures of whatever. But what does that mean? Why is everyone, I don't know, taking pictures of what they're eating, of the tree they see, anything, everything, anything, actually? I have the feeling, and this is my own personal idea, that there is a feeling, but we also need something stable. The picture can also be a sort of desire for something that can stay there forever. So, if we leverage on something that is apparently negative, I think we can work to build a category of values, to build communities, and to build duties. But that can survive if we're convinced that a community can not only be based on rights, but on a right balance, correct balance between rights and duties. Thank you. President Violante mentioned about how to fight against nihilism resulting from social networks whereby everything has to be used and then disappeared. My question to Professor Esposito. What can lead this context? What is the origin of duties in this society where we live today? Why should we abide by a duty? I'm very happy to have a dialogue with President Violante, with Luciano, on this topic. We need to provide a context. We need to understand this topic today and its urgency. So I'm going to start from a word that you mentioned, as in nihilism. The inventor of nihilism, Nietzsche, in one of his famous texts on the three metamorphoses, identified the dragon as the entity that needed to be fought against in order to go back to one's original innocence. On his skin, the dragon had the motto, "You have to." And Nietzsche was a genius because he identified a link between nihilism, and to him, the technical definition of nihilism was very simple, but a striking one. We don't know why. We don't know the reasons why. And nihilism is identified by the system of justifying the world as a way to be. And this is Kant's philosophy. Hence, the use, the root of the word duty. Right is a very sexy word. Duty is not. Duty is a sad word. Even in our daily language, duty is something affecting us, despite us. Think about it. In our mental structure, duty makes us go there where we don't want to go. We're bound to, we're obliged to do something. Why so? Because nihilism stands for Kant's failure, Kant's duties. And this idea of duty by Kant is the leading one. Maybe you remember Kant, you studied him in school. The virtuous man follows duties. Why? Because he has to. You follow duties because it's a duty. Because universal reasoning in all human beings impose duties. This is what every human being has to do. Everything else is done for something else. And this is a pure concept and must remain a pure concept. Péguy wrote about this. Kant's ethics is the ethics whereby men have clean hands. Unfortunately, they have no hands. As in, this concept of duty is meaningless. The virtuous man must kill his desire for happiness. Because according to Kant, the desire for happiness is a private interest, and no one can be happy for me. Each one is happy for himself or herself. No one can be free for me. These are individual skills. And then Kant will continue talking about happiness, but now I don't want to talk about Kant, but I just wanted to make the link between Kant and duty. Duty, which makes a soul full of admiration, the moral raw inside me, the starry sky above me. That comes from the idea that duty wins over happiness, and this is the problem of nihilism. Nihilism stems from the idea that there is a separation between duty and desire for happiness. According to this logic, even the people who refuse a system of duties and focus on the system of rights even in those people, duty must be pursued at all costs to the price of happiness. This is a man's virtue. This stands for a man's virtues. The virtuous man does that. Therefore, duty becomes a pure ideal. Another consequence is that happiness as an individual interest is always impure, is always dirty. By principle, there is a personal interest, and the personal interest must be forgotten in order to be a moral man. A moral man is the great mind, the extraordinary mind, the idea of duty given by enlightenment. Duty is universal. If I do something moral, I have to wonder whether all other men would do the same. And in order to ask myself this question, I need to get far away from what I want to do. As in, this is the drama of duties and nihilism. When Luciano said, how can we overcome this obstacle? How can we overcome nihilism whereby duties are abstract? Duty means you have to be in a certain way, which is not sexy. Duties are not sexy, especially the way we think about them. So I will give you some food for thought. Actually, in any person's life, and also in the history of our own culture, how are duties generated? How are duties born? We are all Kant's children, even though we are against him. But duty is always perceived as the effort, our own effort, the effort of our willingness that has to pursue some obligation. However, the duty comes before our effort, as in the duty is the warning that something is calling upon us. Someone or something is calling upon us, be it Yahweh on Mount Sinai, or our conscience, or some specific moment of our life. It's just as if we said, okay, here I am. Or I am interested in that. The duty does not stem from our effort, does not stem from an idea of something that we needed to achieve, but it is something attractive, it's something sexy, charming. According to Kant, attractiveness and charm must be forgotten, must be eliminated in order to obey to the moral law, to pursue duty. Here there is something calling upon us, and I'll give you an example. How can a child learn duty? Does a child learn duty just because it is imposed as an imperative? Self-control, in that case, it would only be self-control. But teaching duties this way only leads to repressed children. Or maybe can duty be learned just by example, parents' example? Yes, but parents can be wrong. So what? It's disappointing to see that parents can be wrong. Or maybe because duty stems from the relation between the child and the parents. The fact that the children do not want their mother to cry. They are sorry that their mother is not pleased with them. So the reason why children learn that a value is 100% a value is that because we think about our mother's disappointment in our mind, and we don't want to avoid our mother to be disappointed. Now, this might sound very trivial, but this is also witnessed by the history of our culture. Men have not produced these values, but they have learned them just because they belonged to some eras, just because they attended some places, just because they were educated, and then little by little they found out that it was worth it. Lessing in his pamphlet Education to Mankind applies in this context because at the beginning of mankind people were afraid in order to learn duty. Then there was Judaism, God was punishing, but there was education. Then there was Jesus who taught love, and then in modern times, Lessing's times, the 18th century, that education is no longer needed because we've become adults and the reasoning can create its own values. But that was not the case. Values were lost. Hence, the last remark made by Luciano was very interesting. The root of the word duty is sexy, is charming, but is also connected to a sense of belonging to a community, because the community is there where we are educated to be charmed.
Grazie.
Posso interloquire?
Sì, assolutamente.
No, mentre tu parlavi.
May I say something about that? Because while you were talking, something got to my mind. I was a rather good student, and when I used to get a good mark, I told my parents, and they said, well, you just sort of did half of your duties, of your tasks. So the sense of duty stems also from the context you grow up in, because if you're surrounded by people that have a strong sense of responsibility, you will develop that as well. Another thing that came to my mind is the following. I was a member of the Communist Party, and when I was a boy, when I was young, and there were lectures. I was part of the sort of a unit of the Communist Party for the youth. And I remember that there was a lecture about the sense of duty. There was a lot of duties. And I remember 2 or 3 hours of lecture, a Cuban-style lecture. And at the end of that lecture, I thought, well, we have the duty to be sad somehow and to melancholy and mournfulness. But you talked about happiness, but duty is never associated to happiness. It's always perceived and felt as a constraint. So I think that, well, the duty, should be considered as something important, goes beyond the fact that you fulfill something that, is good for the community. Because, I think that many people think that duty do not allow people to be empowered. But I think that this is not the case, because fulfilling one's own duties, you show the fact that you're part of a community. And so somehow you empower yourself through fulfilling a duty that goes, to the benefit of a whole community. Well, that made me think about another thing, because duty is about responding to somebody. So, when it comes to responsibility, it's about being urged. But when it comes about duty, it's like saying yes, responding to somebody, so staying into a relationship. Well, I had prepared another question, and I think that it fits in perfectly, because Costantino Esposito said, there's always something urging us to act. And now President Violante talked about fulfilling one's own duty as a way to empower oneself within a community. There is an exhibition on AVIL here at the meeting, and to AVIL, the duty is the duty of being truthful, the duty of truth within the historic circumstances that he experienced in the city of Prague after the war, so after the totalitarian regime. And these men gets to prison many times, and so he sacrifices his freedom to show the importance and the value of truth, this deep need to enhance truth. It was really a urgent duty inside him. Recently, I read an essay by Hannah Arendt, Lies and Politics, and in this case there is a reflection stemming from the publication in 1971 on the New York Times of the Pentagon Papers, confidential documents of the Defense Department of the US that showed for the very first time ever to the American and world public opinion the absolutely clear awareness of the Pentagon of the strategic usefulness of the war in Vietnam. And so Arendt, faced with that, does not understand how it was possible that so many civil servants decided not to fulfill their duty towards the nation and towards themselves. So Hannah Arendt writes, how could they? So now we are going through the times of fake news, of social networks. Do we still have a duty of truth, and vis-a-vis whom? And then when it comes to politics again, Hannah Arendt reminds us also of the fact that, politics sometimes is not about sincerity, not at all. So lies seem to be accepted and even considered as a necessary tool from time to time. So please tell us more about what you think about the sense of duty in our contemporary society. Well, I'll link up with what you just said. In 1940, Roosevelt was campaigning for elections. It was Democratic, and his opponent was, of course, Republican. And one of these main topics was the following: should the U.S. join the war in Europe that was triggered by the Nazi? And his opponent was a Republican against the participation of the U.S. in that war. And Roosevelt in Boston delivered a very famous speech that had the sentence, watch my lips, no young American will shed their blood. Beautiful sentence, but before that he had made an agreement with Churchill. So in case of victory, the US, would sort of join the democratic forces of Europe against Nazism. But it was a lie, because he had somehow to motivate that. But there was a ship, a ship of the U.S. Navy had spotted a Nazi submarine in free waters and launched some deep bombs towards this Nazi submarine. The submarine came up to the surface and responded to the attack. Immediately, in the US, there was a sort of public outcry about the fact that the Nazi had attacked the US. And of course, then the US joined the war. Fortunately, hopefully they did so, because maybe, I don't know what would have happened. So he lied to the American people. So he somehow created an accident through that first lie, so another sort of lie. But for what? For truth. I mean, it is important to make democracy prevail over dictatorship. So there were different kinds of lies in history. And then there is, and allow me to say, and talked about Catholicism of the Catholic Church, and the right to the communication of truth is not unconditioned. So brotherly love is a principle that needs adaptation, especially in concrete situations. So it is important to evaluate on a case-by-case basis if it is the case to tell the truth or not, according to this principle. So, that said, let's go back to what I said before. Well, in the past there was no traitor, and the US Army joined the war, but nobody knew that. Then an archive official then gave the famous papers to the Washington Post, and so there was a publication. Nixon asked for the sort of stopping of the publication, going back to the papers, and even sort of some officials were replaced. So the Supreme Court was asked to express themselves, and the president of that court said, well, it's not about hiding, it's about unveiling, disclosing, because the citizens have the right to get to know the truth. So, but this is not really about, if it was really important to join the war in Vietnam or not. What matters and counts if the US people was told the truth or not. So it was mostly a sort of conflict between truth and censorship. So that lead us to a conflict between Kant and Benjamin Constant. Kant said, you always have to tell the truth anyway. Constant said, well, it depends. And let's take that case. So somebody is looking for another person to kill that person. Of course, if I'm asked where a person is because that person asking wants to kill the people is looking for, well, I didn't have necessarily to answer, but that person seems to have the right to truth. But, well, when it comes to politics, we have two kinds of lies: strategic lies and tactical lies. For instance, the Turkish sort of deny the massacre of Armenians, and usually those who state and utter that are punished with international commercial relations. Well, being a people with millions of inhabitants, 80 million, well, it's rather serious as a matter if the relations are interrupted. And going back to American history, Kennedy was voting at one point, the aggression to Armenians by the Turks to be considered as a genocide, and so there was an item on an agenda that should have been discussed, and then, well, that was cancelled as an item to be discussed. And there are still people today who deny that the Holocaust ever happened. So the extermination of European Jews. When there was the second war in Iraq, Powell delivered a speech at the UN that showed that there were weapons of mass destruction, but everything was false. Some years ago, I visited the room of the Security Council, and behind the speaker there is a huge sort of panel depicting Guernica, and that was a gift by Ford. It's a piece of tapestry that depicts Guernica. Then at one point that piece of tapestry was removed temporarily just for the time to let Mr. Powell to speak, because there had to be no connection between that painting, that piece of art and Powell's speech. And then there's another anecdote about Tony Blair who favored the war, and when it came out that everything was a lie, the UK Parliament created a special inquiry commission and asked Blair to report, and he said it was not a lie, it was a decision, said Tony Blair. Why? Well, because the Twin Towers had happened, and Iraq had gassed some populations living around the boundaries of the countries that are hostile to it, and so the decision was to attack it. These were the reasons. So Iraq was the country that was then attacked. So it was not a lie, it was a decision. So Tony Blair asked the reason like that, interpreted like that, the reasons for the Iraq war. So Iraq. Well, lie is reinterpreted on another level, the level of political decisions. So who have the right to truth in the political world? Well, politics is based on confidence and trust, because if any politician is campaigning to get consensus, well, usually we take for granted that that politician is telling the truth. If two politicians talk to each other, well, they usually know the other's language, and so usually and certainly they're able to decode what they're saying and know if the other is lying or not. When you get a used car, you know that that used car will be presented by the seller as fantastic and great, but there is a sort of agreement. They know that one of the two is going to lie a bit. So they know the respective sort of borders of lie and truth. But when it comes to their relation to citizens and politicians, well, citizens have the right to be confident. So lying to citizens is even more serious, because it's like having abused that confidence and truth. But citizens have the right to truth. So, and you as a politician, you have the duty to tell the truth. Well, unlike what usually happens when it comes to political negotiations. I think that we should keep this in mind very clearly. Those who do not have the tools to distinguish between lie and truth do not have them. If the people who are supposed to have them do not have them, well, then we have a tricky situation, because if people are deprived of these tools, well, then the duty of truth is even more important. But when we join elections, well, when we go and express our votes, sometimes we do not consider this, because are we voting for the most pleasant politician or for the politician who is telling us the truth? Maybe we tend to vote the politician we like, and this is a problem, because is somehow a smart politician, a clever politician, somebody who is not always telling the truth, then is not going to somehow say as an argument, I represent you. It will say, I am like you. We have so many resemblances. During Trump electoral campaign, I was struck by a sentence that was the following. I love ignorant people. And he had such a sort of round of applause. And that was such a sort of clever sentence. And then somebody in Italy sort of used that sentence. He said, I'm like you. I'm not like those people who go to the movies, read books. I'm like you. I'm an ignorant like you. So we are like each other. So you have to vote for me, not because I'm representing you, but because I'm like you. So this sort of resemblance mechanism is terrible because that pushes the level down and further down. So I'm like what? I am like to something that is at a rather low level. So you will understand that through this mechanism we just lose out on the key role of politics. Politics should be about mutual sort of pedagogy between those who talk and those who listen. So it's not about likeness or resemblance, but it's about sharing and transmitting values that are expressed. And there are reactions, there is consensus, and also there is fight, there is discussion. But this is a typical mechanism of politics. But if instead a sort of resemblance, a similarity mechanism is triggered, then people will opt for the easiest solutions, for the most banal options. So the banalization of reality, well, is the easiest way ever to sort of enhance the likeness and similarity, because you can simply sort of simplify and streamline complex things. So then I have to try to simply stick to the lowest possible ever. So this favors then the consensus. I think that this is the worst lie ever of politics. When a politician rejects their roles as managers of the state, it's like cheating, but in a sort of formal and official context, so in a rigorous way somehow. But if I try to impose this methodology, I will use this similarity principle as a lever. It's not because similarity is wrong by definition, but simply because democratic politics is based on representativeness. I need to argue what I'm standing for, how I want to represent some people or topics, and which are my goals. This is about democracy and democratic policies. But then at the end of the day, if I'm also like you, it's something else. So if I stick just to the resemblance thing, well, this is something that has nothing to do with my sort of my abilities to do something specific, but simply I will try to enhance my similarity. I think this is the worst fraud ever, that goes to the detriment of citizens.
Grazie, mi sembra che il tema della politica.
Thank you. It seems to me that we are now heading towards the third word given the title to this meeting, common good. Everyone is talking about common good. It seems that people are using it too often, and therefore it risks losing its meaning. So, Professor Esposito, Can you give us some ideas on the common good? Yes. I want to go back to what has just been said by President Violante. In 1949, after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, signed on the 10th of December 1948, Albert Camus in France published a text by Simone Weil that was written after the 1940. She died in 1943, entitled Le Racinement. In Italian, it was translated as the first route, prelude to a declaration of duties to mankind. That was the subtitle. Now, the basic idea of this text, which was very difficult, although absolutely very interesting. Simone Weil was a very difficult thinker to understand. So the basic idea was saying that any right is based on a duty. And while rights are determined and influenced, only duties are not conditioned, or rather unconditioned. So it's not that it's an obligation that applies under some circumstances and does not apply under other circumstances. And she wrote that the obligation is always connected to human being as such. There is obligation to any human being just because this is a human being. And there is no other condition applying. I'm not going to read it through because it's difficult for you if you don't have the text. But I was struck by this idea because it means that there is something which is unconditioned in human beings. And this is not just a skill, and this is not just a performance. This is not just an ability to do something or some specific skill, I said, but it's strictly intertwined with the idea of coexistence. And she used Kant's word. This duty is respect. Duty means respects. Achtung was a word used by Kant because it's sort of sacred. Just because we do exist. And what is the political consequence of all this? Simone Weil was a genius because she put together politics and metaphysics. And great politics are always a consequence of metaphysics. They are a way to conceive reality. So the political consequence of all this, she says, is that these duties, which she lists, order, freedom, obedience, responsibility, equality, hierarchy, honor, punishment, freedom of thought, security, risk, private property, collective property, and truth, they are all obligations. When is something an obligation and a duty? When it is needed to feed the human being. This is a very beautiful idea. States try to find consensus, try to seek power. But the duty of politics is to feel obliged to make available what can feed the human being, feed not just the body, but also the soul. And one last thing I'm going to quote from this text. Man does not need potatoes nor rice, but it needs nourishing. It needs heating, not coal. Clearly, heating is made by wood or coal. Nourishing is made by rice and potatoes. But rice and potatoes are just an opportunity for feeding people. And truth is the same way. So our duty to truth is not an abstract duty, although it is sacred, but it is something that has to nourish our soul. Politics, conceived as nourishing man, is something different. So this is what a duty can be in politics.
Riprendiamo questo tema sulla politica. Adesso rilanciamo.
Okay. Let's go back to duty on politics, because the task of politics is often said to be the common good, but maybe it's the personal good, meant in line with our with Article 2 in our Constitution. So the common good can also be used by people holding power in order to pursue personal interests, which have nothing to do with the concrete man, as Abel used to say. So, President Violante, help us on that. Common good and person. What is needed today? What are the expectations of our time in this respect? I believe that the starting point can be an idea on democracy. Because democracy is going through a very peculiar situation. Those who have democracy are not satisfied. Those who don't have democracy want it, like Hong Kong and Russia. There are protests in order to have democracy. But we, having democratic countries, are not happy. So why people who don't have democracy want it and those who have democracy are not satisfied? Why is that? In my opinion, what we call liberal democracy, I'm going to use this this sentence, a liberal democracy. I don't know whether liberalism is a way to reach democracy. The liberal conception of market and society strongly leads to selfishness. There is no sense of community, there is no sense of mutual duties and obligations. The person is at the heart of everything, but becomes a selfish. Personal ambitions, personal ideas and projects are of the utmost importance. So this leads to self-destroyment. As in the unsatisfaction, the fact that people are not satisfied with liberal democracy is due to the fact that there's too much liberalism, which is not offset by democracy. There's a strong focus on the person, on the individual, also goes against culture, because culture is something difficult. Having knowledge is something difficult. Recently, I've seen a young MP in government, a very important economist, and she said, I've studied these topics. So what? And she didn't know that she was focusing on very important topics, and she had studied very important topics. So we should find another definition for democracy. Liberal democracy means something, but now has a different meaning, because it was in the past seen versus other systems. Now history has changed, and that word risks having a totally different meaning from the past, compared to the past. And democracy is never happy with itself. We're talking about equality, but the lack of equality is now quite normal. And democracy means that we needed to overcome lack of equality, inequalities. Democracy is a never-ending story. There's not semi-democracy or illiberal democracy. You either have democracy or you don't have democracy. It's like being pregnant. Either you're pregnant or you're not pregnant. At some point, Orban said, we are building an illiberal democracy or non-liberal democracy. The criticism to liberalism made by Putin, Orban, and Modi from India is something to be to pay attention to. We need to understand what is behind that idea in order to have a clear idea. Modi, Orban, Putin, in different forms, are criticizing an excess of individualism, and the fact that the person is more important than the community. And then they say it the other way around, and they want to punish it. And there is also some religious content in that. I always say that there are believers with no religion, and I'm one of them, and there are religious people who do not believe. If I have a bunch of olive tree in my hand, I'm a non-believer, but mine is a religious action. Orban, Putin, or Modi are strictly connected to religious actions, not faithful actions, but religious actions. So this is a very serious problem concerning democratic issues, because in a common good there's democracy. If there's no democracy, there's no common good. There's a crisis discriminating people. I had goosebumps when I saw that on the border with Hungary there was a long queue of people saying prayers against migrants arriving in Hungary. This is contradictory. This is a violent use of religion against other people. This is religion with no faith, the religion of non-believers. And we need to pay attention to that. We need to be careful. And the common good consists in unveiling these processes. I don't think that the common book is a box where we all are. It is something difficult to build. So, everyone is engaged to build the common good through duties, through the balance of rights and duties, by strengthening communities. So the traditional mechanism, the community is based on family, neighborhood, state, mankind. Let's see it the other way around. Terenzio, who was a distinguished figure in Roman times, said that there is nothing human which is stranger to me. So let's start from the human dimension, because we have to start from the family, and then the family, the values are lost the further you go away from the family. So I believe that the common good is an ongoing process. Is something hard to build. Living is beautiful because it is hard. I don't know whether we can solve the issue between good and evil. If that fight was solved, what would the meaning of our life be? What would be our function as human beings? By building the good, by building a common good, we are human beings. We are fighting together to build a common good. And this is priceless. Because we fight against the evil. So, this is how I see the common good. The common good is an aspect of democracy, is effective for democracy, but is also an aspect for the hardness of being human beings.
Proprio una battuta su questo.
Let me say something on this. I believe that the problem of the common good is that when we pronounce this word, we usually identify something abstract, an abstract principle. The fact that we need to make something that can find consensus and that can meet the shared needs. But the common good is learned only when it's a historical event, only with the gaze of relatives, of uncles, grandmothers, parents, of your association, of your class. It is common good is always something performing, which is not based on principles, but on examples, which is not based on general values, but on historical experiences. No one denies that we have to tend to a common good. The point is that we have to promote the experience of a common good. Like let's remember that individualism stands for the person. You said, Luciano, that democracy is the link between rights, individual rights and needs, and collective responsibilities. Maybe liberal democracy should be reviewed as the opportunity, the possibility to combine freedom and truth. I know that it seems very abstract as a concept, but if you look at them from an historical perspective, every human being has to pursue a certain direction and is entitled to go their own way. Because a democratic state, or a liberal state, as we say, is a place where everyone is not denied and is given the tools to develop oneself for self-realization. But this idea of self-realization must be based on truth. Truth to us is somewhat a constraint in some extent. According to the principles of classical liberalism, the freedom of truth would be the fact that we don't need to go beyond certain limits. Otherwise, other people's freedom would be jeopardized. So no one can jeopardize my possibility to be free. So you are free until you're not in conflict with others. But there's another way to look at truth, at the truth. The society is not the truth of the individual, it's quite the opposite. But society is a dimension, is the true dimension in politics of individual freedom. In order to reach a self-realization, you need to be with others, and therefore others are not a constraint for me. They do not jeopardize my desire for belonging. The two alternatives the two options of modern times pose problems. Hobbes and Rousseau. On the one hand, you need to have a strong power, a sovereign king, enabling us to live all together, to coexist. Each one of us alienates his own freedom to the king in order to ensure peaceful coexistence. Otherwise, we would only kill each other. We go from liberalism to authoritarianism. And then you have Rousseau's model on the other end. And what you said on ignorance beforehand was quite impressive, because Rousseau was clearly stating that the only way to achieve social happiness is ignorance, as in the culture, arts, society, lead to corruption, lead to disequality. But we need to be citizens. We need to get rid of our personal identity, and from man, each one of us needs to become a citizen. So we need to give up our own personal identity. So in both cases, you need to give up something. Society means giving up your individual identity. What if society is the true dimension of the individual person? There's moments when freedom was an absolute value in magazines, in newspapers. Now, sometimes the people who said that, the people who stated that, are now puzzled at fake news. And it's a sort of contradiction. Why? Because freedom cannot stand without truth. It has to discover the truth in itself. Because the trace of the truth is the fact that we are with others. We live because of others, because we coexist with others. And this is the only way to achieve self-realization. This is the common good. So the common good is a challenge. It is not an ideal that is given top-down, but it's a hard and charming journey of self-realization.
Grazie.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I have a last question for President Violante. And I would like to link up to this topic of sociability. I think that our relations today more than ever are characterized by the lack of trust and confidence. You talked about the use of violence against the other. This is something that occurs anywhere, in workplaces, in schools. I mean, this is unfortunately part of our life. So, in your opinion, is there some light at the end of the tunnel? Is there some hope? How could we start rebuilding and reconstructing the trust in the other and try to sort of make up the pieces of this sense of sociability? Well, if I had a recipe or a secret, that would be extraordinary. Well, again, living is about pain. Life is painful, but it's an interesting pain. It's something interesting. So I was rereading the first lines of Genesis. So, and God created the sky and the earth. The earth was shapeless, and darkness was all over the place, and the Spirit of God was floating above the waters. So there was darkness, there was an abyss. And creation is something that has to do with darkness, but also with creation. So little by little, well, of course, it's not about sort of taking things, specifically, but, well, why does it take 6 days to God to create the world? Because it's difficult, it's tiring. So again, it's tiring. Well, on the 7th, he needed some rest as well. So we need to understand the message of this very first line of the Genesis. So it is about the exhausting effort of building and constructing. So even a powerful entity has to sort of go through difficulties. So I think that we have to accept and understand the meaning and value of obstacles and difficulties and pain. So our task is to fulfill common good and to understand this. And I think that this is key, and this includes trust towards the other, the confidence toward the other. Otherwise, we would live in an ironical way. So, and somehow, being trustful and having trust and confidence is the prerequisite to build a future. And today, there's too much attention on the present. Nobody's interested in the future. And what you need to build a future is trust and confidence. I'm organizing a number of conferences in Rome where the key word is the following: future is a hospitable land. This is the title, catchphrase, so to speak. It's not about expressing some sort of willingness. We need to act, not to stick to word. So if the words of the Genesis are sort of still meaningful, we need to understand that to build, you need to work hard. It's about effort. And again, it's about sort of going through difficulties and obstacles and overcome them. So, and any construction within the family, with friends, in the society, implies confidence and trust. Those who do not want to build and construct is because they lack confidence. Sometimes the lack of confidence is an alibi. I'm struck sometimes by the negative vision that we have of ourselves and of our country. Well, nothing functions, but of course we know that this is not the case, but this works as a sort of very effective mechanism to get rid of responsibility. Well, if we stick just to what doesn't work, okay, I'm okay, because, well, nothing functions, nothing works, so, well, it's up to the others to start doing something, because otherwise it would be useless. So I think we should have a different attitude towards our country and be more realistic. Do you know how many judges have been killed in Italy? 24. No other country had such a high death toll of judges. And then journalists that were killed. So many, a very high number. Because let's tell the truth. So those who killed them, mafia or terrorists, especially mafia, did not want these journalists to tell the truth. And judges were mostly killed by terrorists. Then we had 9 massacres from Piazza Fontana and some sort of coup that were attempted. So, if Falcone, Borsellino, Dalla Chiesa and Moro would still alive, would have lived, what would happen? No other democracy has experienced the same. But we went forward. We remained a democratic country in spite of all that. And there were terrible episodes in other countries, and I must say that terrorist cells sometimes have been able to penetrate in other countries because there was a laissez-faire attitude by controllers. We had no mastermind, so we had no such a thing. We won with the law, with the rules, and when terrorists refused the trial, and the attorneys and lawyers. So, many lawyers presented themselves. And when the judges were killed, new judges were appointed. This is the force of a country. The fact that it has the strength to go on. We need to respect this strength. And if we will be respectful towards this strength, and being aware of our limits and boundaries. But of course, this is the only way to rekindle trust and confidence, to redevelop that. We need to share this and pass this on to the next generations. Truth is the message, but we need to have the courage to utter the truth, to recognize the truth and utter the truth, because this is the only way to build up confidence again. And we have the duty to pass on to next generations a better country with respect to what we are living in now. So those who think that the generational flow can't be stopped is absolutely wrong. And so those who have always believed that the palingenesis was right, they're wrong, because to build a future you need the past. With no past you have no future. So we need, I think, to consider this as a duty. We have the duty to have enough trust to know that we can build a future. So, but first of all, we need to have trust in ourselves, and then in our country, and then in what we can express, and then all the rest. All the rest will come.
Mentre ti
While I was listening to you, I remembered one of the first words you uttered, nihilism. How is it possible to reconstruct confidence in the desert of nihilism? And well, being here at the meeting, I must say that I can see that in order to recreate confidence in politics, we need to have people joining events where they can get trust. So, because people have to be seen not as wolves towards other men, but not even simply by saying, okay, come on. I mean, we need to see that there is a sense of living that is much greater than any kind of achievement that still we have to strive for. But again, we need educational places. We need sort of educational friendship. We need such dialogues and exchanges, because these are the only way to understand that there is a meaning. Because, well, if somebody has unconditional trust in me, I will get a sense of my worth, and maybe I will have enough strength to somehow try to live with those who do not agree with my ideas. So I would like to thank my guests, and before greeting you, I want to say that building the common good is exhausting, it's tiring, and Professor Esposito said that we need to act. We can all contribute to the construction of a little piece of common good by helping the meeting out, donating even little, and please do it at any Donate Now station. I would like to thank our guests once again, and I wish you a very nice evening. Thank you very much indeed.